Welcome, everyone. My name is Roger Berkowitz. I'm the founder and academic director of the Hannah Arendt Center for Politics and Humanities at Bard College. Thrilled to be with you today. We are entering the last chapter of Hannah Arendt's On Revolution. It's a book that, when we started it, I said was, I think, the most relevant today of Arendt's books, and I think that our reading has borne that out, and the last chapter is maybe the most relevant. Um, and we're going to split it into two. It's a long chapter. We'll read part one and two this week, and then we take uh, I think 2 weeks off for the holiday, and because I'm traveling again, and then we'll be meeting on December 12th for the conclusion to the book, and I hope you can join us. Um, so on Revolution began with the inquiry into revolution. Revolution, as Arendt tells us, is the foundation of freedom. Um, it's not simply liberation from a tyrant or unfreedom. It's founding freedom. And um, one of the things that we're going to focus on in chapter six, what we're reading today and next time, is that the foundation of freedom um, is somewhat ambivalent in that it's going to be both the experience of something new, the beginning of something new, a foundation, and thus uh, a kind of spontaneous act. But as a foundation, it's also stable and something that lasts. And it's this um, need for both the new and the lasting that is so central to Arendt's reading of revolutionary foundations of freedom. And in chapters four and five, which we've read the last few sessions on Constitutio Libertatis, we looked at two different aspects of foundation and the foundation of freedom, the Constitutio Libertatis. A constituere is a constituting, a setting up of liberty. How does one set up liberty? Well, a constitutio, a constitution. It's to establish it, to found it. And what she's arguing in those two chapters are a number of things, but one is that a constitution of liberty or of freedom, a foundation of liberty or freedom, requires a constitution, not as a written document per se, although that can help, but as a establishing, a setting up of freedom and different parts of freedom. And chapters four and five take a look at the American Constitution, which she thinks has been the most successful, and say that there are um, two fundamental successes of the American Constitution. One is that it establishes a balance of power, a multiplication of power, or in another way of putting it, it does what no one else had been able to figure out how to do before, which is to establish the power of beginning and the power of action without running into the danger of one power overwhelming all the other powers and creating a tyranny. And it does this, she argues, through the principle of federalism, which she argues is the animating and core principle of the American Constitution. It comes out of this experience of constituting that the Americans had even before the Constitution had been written, through the state constitutions and even back to the Mayflower Compact. But it's also for her this deep belief that they take from Montesquieu and from experience, that freedom is not freedom from, it's not civil liberties, it's freedom to, it's the freedom to act and to build and to found a politics. And as a result, she says that they understood that you had to empower, not limit power. And so the Constitution, again, there was no Bill of Rights in the original Constitution. They added it on as a compromise. But the Constitution for her is an empowering document. Empowering what? Well, the freedom to act and to constitute and to found freedom. And the way it protects itself from power becoming irresponsible or centralized is through the multiplication of powers, not only through the three branches of the federal government, but also through the states and also through um, uh, the spirit of American nonprofit groups and non-governmental agencies and this spirit of freedom that had sort of experienced and grown through the colonies and through their history. And so, on the one hand, the first sort of great innovation of the American Constitution is this federalist principle, which leads to the conclusion that there is no sovereignty in the American Constitution and the American Republic. Um, and that for her is the first big uh, advantage or success of the American Constitution. The second, largely talked about in chapter five, although it's already hinted at in chapter four, is that uh, one of the great problems of all modern revolutions and foundations of freedom is that while you can create power, the power um, often won't last very long. It's not stable because it's constantly refounding and empowering, and there's constant desire to rebel against it. And so you need a kind of authority. And the problem with authority in the modern world is that there are no authorities in the modern world. Religion, after the Enlightenment, has been put into question. Um, any particular power that establishes itself and tries to imagine itself as a permanent and stable authority is subject to being questioned. I mean, that's what the very core of the Enlightenment is, and the founders were nothing if not Enlightenment thinkers. And so, in both the United States and in France, the problem of the revolution came how to establish authority. And many of the leading figures on both sides of the Atlantic uh, sought to try and create a kind of civic religion, where you would uh, try and make a worship of some, political god, or at least use religion as as a means of asserting the authority of the Constitution or of the government. And that doesn't work very well. It's not total failure, but it doesn't work very well. But what Arendt comes to believe is that the American Constitution again succeeded where the French failed, in this time because somehow the Constitution came to be worshipped. And how exactly that happens is not always clear. But they created this document, this actual Constitution, and they came to believe that the Constitution was a kind of spiritual guarantee, that it was an authority that they would not break. And, this idea of an oath to the Constitution, which we're hearing a lot about this week, as certain of our senators and Congress people who are military veterans remind us that all American public servants, whether in the military or in Washington, swear an oath to serve not any one person but the Constitution. And this constitutional worship is aided and abetted by the American innovation of the Supreme Court, right? It's something that really was new. That she says was they took the principle of the Senate, of the Senate as an aristocratic body that had served and whose members traced their lineage as aristocrats back to the founding of Rome, and that the Senate uh, supplements the popular house of the Roman Republic um, with a kind of authority of the founders. And in the same way, these Supreme Court justices who wear their robes and the wigs and have no power, but are sitting there simply as, like priests reading and interpreting the Constitution. They have a kind of authority uh, without power. In fact, their authority comes almost from being without power. That gives them and the Constitution this kind of worshipful quality and provides the kind of authority that uh, that says that the power that the government wields not only is power, but has legitimacy and authority. And she says these two institutions, the Supreme Court and the Constitution on the one hand for authority, and the Federalist principle with no sovereignty on the other, really do go a long way to constituting freedom, to founding freedom in the American Republic. Okay, so that's the sort of strong positive reading of why, in this comparative sense, the American Republic, at least to some extent, succeeded, whereas the French largely did not. We now come to the last, longest chapter of the book, or one of the longest chapters of the book, the revolutionary tradition and its lost treasure. And you can hear right in the title, we're now about to look at another side of the question, right? Which is that the American Revolution and the constitutional tradition um, was a treasure in that it founded freedom, and yet it's been lost. Now, it's been lost sounds quite declarative. Arendt sometimes speaks that way, but she also sometimes speaks in the sense of, well, it's in danger of being lost. And I think that, you know, she means both. I think she, on the one hand, does think it has been lost. On the other hand, she thinks that it's still there to be found, and it's our job to preserve it and find it. So, um, uh, we are now going to, in these four sections of chapter six, we're going to look deeply at the loss of this revolutionary tradition, this public spirit, this foundation of freedom. But also, in looking at its loss, we're going to be thinking about how it might be reinvigorated or refound, um, refounded. And these are all parts of her thought. So it's in four parts, as I said. The first part, which begins in my book on page 217, in the Penguin edition, I think 207, she frames it as the question of, can the Senate and the Supreme Court preserve the revolutionary tradition? I think this is a question many people are asking today, right? And that's one of the reasons this is such a timely book. She sees the Senate and the Supreme Court as the two institutions, the two most important institutions in the foundation of freedom and the stabilization of the foundation of freedom. They are the two most conservative of the institutions of the American Constitution and the American government, and that's why she thinks they're so important. Um, the French Revolution, she says, has largely determined our reading of revolutions throughout history. And as a result, this tradition of the Senate and the Supreme Court and the way they preserve the revolutionary tradition have been lost in most other revolutions because they weren't in the French, and they haven't been preserved. The American Revolution, she thinks, failed to be incorporated in the general revolutionary story that we tell, for a number of reasons. But the main one is that it never became theorized. That doesn't mean that the American revolutionaries didn't read books or didn't theorize. They did. They turned to Montesquieu and they turned back to the Romans. But they didn't, she says, once the revolution happened, they didn't write down a theory. They didn't put it in a conceptual framework, is the word she uses. And remembrance needs a conceptual framework. This is a really interesting, side point of of the story here. But that you can't just do it in practice. Someone has to put it down and think it, and they never did. And in many ways, this chapter is an extraordinarily original chapter. I mean, we have to start there. I mean, her reading of the Supreme Court and the Senate in this way is not one you're going to see in other American political history books. This is a very original reading, as were chapters 4 and 5. And in some ways, Arendt is, I think, trying to do what she says wasn't done, which is give a conceptual framework to the American Revolution. Um, the failure of this revolutionary tradition can be seen in three events or three characteristics that she talks about early on in the chapter. The first is in foreign policy, namely that other revolutions appeal to the French, not the American Revolution. That the American foreign policy, she says, has become fearful of other revolutions. We are on the side of strongmen and dictators and against revolutions. And she says that's largely because, again, we failure to remember our revolutionary tradition as the foundation of freedom because it hasn't been remembered, it hasn't been conceptualized. The second is that we failure to remember this revolutionary tradition insofar as we confuse freedom, public freedom, with free enterprise or economic growth. And she says here that economic growth may actually be a curse in that sense, in that it turns us away from the memory of the foundation of freedom. And then the third is that we failure to remember that the distance between tyranny and a constitutional government of civil rights is as great as the distance between a constitutional government of civil rights and a free republic. We have largely embraced a constitutional limited government of civil rights, and in doing so, we have forgotten the core achievement of the revolutionary tradition, the treasure, which was a free republic, a government of freedom. We've forgotten and we failed to remember that political freedom is the right to be a participator in government, and we become satisfied with a combination of economic growth and civil liberties. Um, and so the claim that America has lost its revolutionary spirit is a claim that we've failed to remember our principles. Namely, the principles are that public freedom and public happiness and the public spirit are not the same as private happiness, civil liberties, and welfare, right? And again, this isn't a book written against capitalism. I know some people will read it that way. I don't think it is. Um, she does say at one point that capitalism has failed to provide freedom and even a good life for people in every country except America. Um, we can have that argument, but she's not arguing against American capitalism per se, although I don't think she's a capitalist in the strong sense. But what she is saying is that the focus on happiness, liberty, and welfare turns us away from and allows us to forget public freedom, public happiness, and the public spirit. So there's these two forces of the revolutionary spirit, right? One is the active foundation, this foundation of freedom, the exhilaration and awareness of the faculty of a human beginning. In a revolution, we start something new. We exert power. We act together. Power is the collective action of people acting for some goal. And on the other hand, there was this grave concern with stability and durability. We don't want to just create newness. We want the newness to establish freedom, found freedom in a way that lasts. We want lasting blessings of freedom. Um, and so there's a need, she says, to recapture, right? And here is where she makes this move that goes on throughout this whole chapter of on the one hand saying we've lost it, on the other hand, there's this need to recapture the lost spirit of the revolution. She says on page 225, by thinking together and combining meaningfully what our present vocabulary presents to us in terms of opposition and contradiction. And here, what she means is that we think of aristocracy and democracy, government by a few elite and government by the many, as opposites and contradictions. And yet, she says the founders did not. Right? They were seeking to actually bring these together in a common idea. They were trying to understand the way in which uh, democracy, the appeal to the many, and aristocracy, the appeal to the few, could together uh, offer something that other people had forgotten. And so there's this actual idea um, of a solidarity. When we talked about solidarity back in chapter 2 on the social question near the end of it, where she says that solidarity is different from pity because solidarity speaks to the grandeur of human dignity and the grandeur of human spirit. It seeks to unite everyone, the rich and the poor, the aristocrats and the democrats, the few and the many. And here on page 226 and 215 to 216 in the Penguin edition, she says that the effort to recapture the lost spirit of revolution must, to a certain extent, consist in the attempt at thinking together and combining meaningfully what our present vocabulary presents to us in terms of opposition and contradiction, namely democracy and aristocracy. Two sides, she says, of the same coin. We need to combine also stability and durability with the spirit of the new. And the great advantage of American republicanism, she says, is durability. Now, this is going to be a surprise, right, to many of us. It's durability and stability and not equality, she says on 227 or page 220, 216 in the Penguin edition. She points to the reverence that the founders had for Sparta and Venice, two republics that they found incredibly influential and meaningful, neither of which are defined very much by equality, and yet were beloved because of their stability. They saw democracy as turbulent, leading to conformity and instability, whereas they saw these republics having difference and plurality, but also stability. And on page 227 or 216 at the bottom, 216, she says that the word senatus, the senates, became a word for them that stood in for authority and stability. Um, and that there were two main institutions that sought to provide stability within the American framework of government. And these were the Senate and the Supreme Court. She calls them the most conservative factors in the body politic. The Senate and the Supreme Court, she argues, were lasting institutions for opinion and a lasting institution for judgment. So the Supreme Court is the lasting institution that endures, that provides public judgment through its decisions. And the Senate is the lasting institution that provides for opinion. Now, there's a long discourse on what opinion is here. And we have to understand that for her, where the Senate is designed to address what she calls the problem of public opinion as incompatible with the freedom of opinion. And the reason that public opinion is a problem and incompatible with freedom of opinion is that she believes that if you have public opinion, it's always singular, that it's driven by passions, and it leads to an opinion that drowns out and, in a sense, says all other opinions are wrong. It's the problem of the French idea of the will, the general will, or the will of the nation. It's the problem of the demagogue who says that I know what America is, and America is this, and tells you that it's one opinion. Um, and she says that opinion emerged in both the American and French revolutions, but it was only the American Revolution that she says, quote, knew how to build a lasting institution for the formation of public views into the very structure of the republic. And that institution is, in her mind, the Senate. She now quotes a number of Federalist Papers here to articulate this idea. So in Federalist 50, which she quotes on page 227 or 217, she says that democracy leads to conformity of opinion, and that we need to replace public opinion, which leads to conformity, with the public spirit that is not governed by common passions. She says that rule based on public opinion is tyranny, and that leads to the abhorrence of democracy by the founders because they thought that democracy would lead to public opinion. And the Senate is proposed by the founders as the answer to this problem. Why? Because the Senate was a small number of people, right? Only two senators per state at that time. I guess 26. They were there to assemble and deliberate. You all, many of you at least, if you're from America, you've heard this line that is trotted out every once in a while by senators who would like it to be true, where they say that the Senate is the greatest deliberative body in the world. That's what Arendt is here referring to. That the Senate was designed not to be a democratic body, right? In fact, the senators, you'll recall in the Constitution, were not elected by the people. They were chosen by the state legislatures of the state. So the New York state legislatures, up now in Albany, would get together and choose two senators. They weren't subject to popular election. They weren't supposed to be. They weren't representatives in that sense. They were a deliberative body. And the idea of them as a deliberative body was to purify the opinions of the people. And so in Federalist 10, which she quotes on page 229 or 219, she says that opinions arise throughout the polity, but they need to be purified through representation. So the Senate is not a democratically elected body. It's appointed by the state legislatures. But the idea was that they were representative of the people, not in the sense that they would do what the people said, represent the people, but they would represent them in that they would deliberate for them and purify their opinions to get to a more rational, reasonable, and meaningful idea of freedom. She then quotes Federalist 49 on page 230 or 219, and she says that, quote, the reason of man, like man himself, is timid and cautious when left alone, and acquires firmness and confidence in proportion to the number with which it is associated. So here again, there's a theory of deliberation going on here. Opinions are formed and tested in exchange of opinions against opinions, right? So some of you know that we've been doing a lot of work at the Arendt Center on citizens' assemblies as a deliberative bodies, and the idea is not you pick these people randomly and you put them in the assembly. It's not that they represent the people; it's that through the act of deliberating and talking, right, they somehow come to a better opinion. They purify the opinions. And this is what she thought the Senate was for and could do. What was needed, the founders thought, was a lasting institution for the purification and formation of not public opinion, but what she calls public spirit. And in this sense, and for this reason, the Senate is for her the third essential institution of American government. Remember, in Chapter 4, we talked about how the Federalist spirit, and thus the division and multiplication of powers was the first core institutional framework of the American constitutional system. And in chapter 5, we talked about how the Supreme Court, that has no power but authority and purifies judgment, was the second essential framework and institution for the American Constitution. And what she's arguing here is that the Senate, which sifts opinion and creates a lasting institution for the discovery of a public spirit, which is not public opinion, is the third essential institution of American government. What was sought, she said, was an immortal commonwealth that would last for generations. And the question she ends this first part of chapter 6 with is on page 234 or 223 is, could the Senate and the court, the Supreme Court, succeed in preserving the revolutionary spirit, right? An open question. Now, one thing she doesn't talk about is that by the time she's writing this, the Senate has become a democratically elected body. I forget which amendment that was, but someone will put it in the chat, I'm sure. And she thinks that's she doesn't talk about it. I don't know if she thinks that's a good thing or a bad thing. But it certainly is part of the loss of the Senate as this deliberative body, as it becomes more of a responsively democratic body. And so can the Senate and the court succeed in preserving this revolutionary spirit? This brings us to part 2 of the chapter, in which she says that, again, the failure of the revolution was preceded by the failure to provide a lasting institution for the revolutionary spirit. And now she's saying that the foundation requires permanence, right? It requires a lasting institution, the Senate, the court, and the Constitution. But that in some ways there's a contradiction here, or a paradox, because the revolutionary spirit is split. On the one hand, it has power and the experience of newness and the ability to create new things. On the other hand, it needs stability, and they are at odds with one another. And she says, of all the founders, the one who understood this best was Thomas Jefferson. And he says that what the American Revolution was about was not democracy, but revolution. He says that it's not democracy, but revolution ought to be a right of every man in every generation. And he was outraged at times that the founders, and only the founders, could be the revolutionaries, the beginners. And he saw that as a problem. When there was the rebellion early on, the Shays Rebellion, um, Jefferson was in France, and he wrote, "God forbid we should ever be 20 years without such a rebellion." He said a little rebellion is a good thing. He also is famous for the line, "The tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. It is its natural manure." It's something to think about, right? As we have are going through a period of rebellion, a destruction, um, and we had a rebellion 4 years ago on January 6th of some sorts, and many people would say we're in one now. And Jefferson was someone who thought, we need that. You need some rebellion every once in a while, because if you don't have blood, again, this is what he writes, and I think it's what he thinks, and she thinks it's right. If you don't every once in a while fight for your freedom and have blood by the patriots and the tyrants, you're not going to live free. You're going to be caught up in being ruled by a bureaucratic class. And so the problem that Jefferson and Arendt come to see is that the Constitution, for all of its successes, and even with the imagination of the Senate and the court and the separation and multiplication of powers of the Federalist principle, there was one great missing lacking institution. And that was a space, an institutional space where citizens could exercise freedom. The revolution, she writes, while it had given freedom to the people and had given an institutional space for freedom to the elected representatives in Congress or in the state houses, did not provide a space where freedom could be exercised by everyday people, right? And part of the reason was is that she says the Americans all were part of townships and town governments, and they felt free and they exercised their freedom, and they didn't see the need to put that in the Constitution because they took it for granted. But the townships, which Tocqueville called the school of the people, where people could get to come together and talk and govern themselves, eventually became to wither away, and they weren't represented in the Constitution. In fact, the only levels of government in the Constitution are the federal government and the state governments. County governments are not in the Constitution. And so, in some Supreme Court cases, when counties wanted to govern themselves and states said no, the court has said, well, counties have actually no constitutional rights. Cities have no constitutional rights in our Constitution. So, the fact that there are cities, New York City or, Red Hook, where the two places I live, they have no rights. The state of New York could take away all their rights to self-government because under our Constitution, at least this federal Constitution, cities and counties have no rights. And this absence, this was an oversight, according to Jefferson, and Arendt and Jefferson come to think that this was one of the great oversights of the Constitution. It comes from the fact that representative government was always a complicated and difficult and contradictory idea. On the one hand, there's this theory of representative government where the representatives are simply representatives of the people, substitutes for the fact that not all the people can fit in one room. And they're supposed to simply be agents of the people. The problem there, of course, is what do the people want? It's hard to know what the people want, but their job is to try and figure it out and simply enact it. But there's another idea of representative government, right? Which is that the representatives are popularly controlled by the people once every 2 or 4 years or 6 years. But they are actually, once they're elected, they're there to rule as representatives in their own sense of what is right and wrong. And for Arendt, this tension between these two ideas of representations has been definitive and defining. In any case, the people can either be corrupted in the sense that they simply allow the representatives to rule and sink into lethargy, and they, in a sense, concern themselves only with their private lives and business and leave the public life to the representatives, at which point the people become corrupted. Or the people can preserve a spirit of resistance to all government because the only power they have is the power of resistance or of revolution. And they fight against all government. But what they don't have are spaces where they can actually govern. They don't have spaces where they can participate in government. And she says that Jefferson, looking at this situation, feared that the United States could become an electoral despotism, electoral tyranny, a fear many people have today, right? And she says that what saved the government from despotism was the Federalist principle and the machinery of government, which created these multiplication of powers and these balance of powers that prevented electoral despotism, at least has so far. But it could not save the people from corruption, she thought. The Constitution itself had cheated them. That's on page 242 or 231. She then turns to France and does a historical dive into the French Revolution and the Paris Commune sections and these talking societies. And the point of this is simply to show that even Robespierre, at least early on, understood that you needed institutions where people could gather and talk and think about the public world to instruct and to enlighten their fellow citizens on the true principles of the Constitution, and freedom. Um, Robespierre early on called these talking societies in France the first manifestation of freedom. And she sees in them the kind of germ of Jefferson's idea of participators in government. Um, un- However, by the time Robespierre and the Jacobins took power, they reversed themselves in 1793 and talked about these popular society as so-called popular societies. They now saw them as a problem for the indivisible will of the nation. And once they were in power, the Jacobins say that freedom is only in private. Um, and so she turns to France in the end of part two of this chapter, chapter six, in order to show how these the desire for a foundation of freedom led to these societies in France, but they were quickly quashed. That's how we end part two. Part three, which we'll start talking about in 2 weeks, uh, develops this third further through this idea of revolutionary councils and Jefferson's ward system. But we'll get there next week. Okay. Like I said, this is an enormously rich and I think powerful uh, and I think both depressing and hopeful. I think she really does identify some of the um, challenges and ways in which freedom in the American tradition has been lost and the revolutionary spirit has been lost, but also points to ways in which it might be reinvigorated. And, again, there's not just one, but these citizens' assemblies, which the Arendt Center has become, a big player in and promoter of, is one way to, well, the way I see them, is that these citizens' assemblies can become new institutional spaces for public freedom, exactly the kind of spaces that she says were the were what was forgotten and overlooked in the constitutional tradition. Okay, there's a lot to talk about. You can talk in the chat. Please be respectful. I see. Oh my God, I see a lot of hands. That's great. Keep your questions brief if you can, because I see a lot of hands, and I look forward to the conversation. John, you're up.
Simple request for clarification. At the beginning of your presentation, you talked about the federalist principle of no sovereignty. Um, and my understanding of the idea of sovereignty in the United States is popular sovereignty, not no sovereignty, but popular sovereignty, which was alluded to at the end of the Gettysburg Address uh, of the people, for the people, by the people. Um, so, can I get a clarification on that?
Yeah. So Arendt doesn't think that there is popular sovereignty in the United States. She says, I'm just trying to find the quote. It's on page 152 in my book, 144 in the Penguin book. Um, she says that she's talking about Federalist 14, and hence, if the government of the particular states were abolished, the governments of the particular states were abolished, the general government would be compelled by the principle of self-preservation to reinstate them in their proper jurisdiction. In this respect, the great and in the long run, perhaps the greatest American innovation in politics as such was the consistent abolition of sovereignty within the body politic of the Republic, the insight that in the realm of human affairs, sovereignty and tyranny are the same. So, what she has in mind here is that there is no single sovereignty. Popular sovereignty of what? First of all, of the states, okay, but they then are countered by the popular sovereignty of the nation. Oh, so popular sovereignty of the nation? No, because the states have power over and against the nation. And in addition to that, you also have a constitution, and you have the Senate, and you have the Supreme Court. And so for her, um, the very principle, the Federalist principle of division and multiplication and contest of powers, that only power checks power, is the driving force of the constitutional system, and that it stands against any attempt to find one stable source of sovereignty. And that to her, when she says, in this last chapter that we were just talking about, when she says that Jefferson feared a despotism of tyranny, and what protected us against it is the machinery of government, the Federalist principle. That's what she means. She just thinks that she thinks that the system was built with so many fail safes to prevent any one institution, even the popular sovereignty, because again, there's so many different populaces in the United States, from having sovereignty. Obviously, there's the fact that it has held for 250 years doesn't mean it will hold for another 250 years, right? There's no guarantee. And we're at a moment when I think people feel like the system is creaking, and we'll see whether it holds. But she thinks that was what she calls that the political science of the founders, that they really did, through a political science and a study of history, try and develop a system of multiple overlapping contesting powers that would prevent any one power from being sovereign.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Denise. Denise, did you disappear?
Am I here?
There you are. I don't know where you are,
Yeah,
but I hear
yeah.
you.
Okay, thank you. I'm from Brazil, so forgive my English. I want to correct my reading. I'm fascinated by Arendt in this book, and but I read this as ideals, almost utopia. I want you to correct me. Founded in history, of course, but as the social movements in my country are fighting, or in their words, in their proposals, fighting to be horizontal, fighting in a certain way to follow this model. But I want to correct me if Arendt finally saw this as ideas. But I want to do two quick preambles to put another question. The first one is to when you refer to Jefferson almost at the end of your explanation, I remembered Frantz Fanon, which is a thinker and psychiatrist that wrote about African decolonization. And for him, revolution is a right with blood and violence, just as you said. Frantz Fanon put it this way. But my question, as I am in a country much influenced by the United States and the democratic bodies, the Senate and the Supreme Court as values, as value institutions, and we are also a federation, but also a strong influence of the Soviet Union here. For our Communist Party was very strong till the 70s of the 20th century, and the left also, and populism, not only the left, but also populist power. So my question is, when Arendt is talking about the changing in Jefferson and then the changing in Robespierre, and it's in the page, I have the Portuguese translation, of course. It's 2 pages in the end of part two, you come back 2 pages, and at the end of the third page, she's talking about ambitions and fanaticisms that distorted the participation, the revolutionary quest, and the participation. Those words, ambitions and fanaticism. I want you to correct me what I talked about in the beginning of my question. And now, if you explain me why Arendt puts this here, ambitions and fanaticisms, because she doesn't analyze those phenomena.
Yeah. So thank you.
Here are almost not necessary. The word is failing me, but
Yeah.
they are fatal in power, ambitions and fanaticism.
So this is great, Denise. Thank you.
And
I'm
why?
just gonna, I just want to ask
The last
anyone.
commentary, and why she doesn't go to the economic interests and ambitions, not in the Marxist version of this. No, let's forget Marx here, the infrastructure and so on, and the economicism. But why she doesn't mention the economic forces that are at play when this model, this historical revolutionary quest changed. Thank you.
Thank you. Does anyone see where the paragraph in which Denise is talking about? Because I don't see it, and I'm just trying to understand where we are.
When she's writing about the French Revolution, of course.
Yeah.
It's the paragraph that begins, in our context, it's primarily the latter aspect.
Oh, okay. All right, let me take a look at it. In our context, it is primarily the latter aspect of the conflict which must interest us, and it is therefore of no small importance to note that the societies, in distinction from the clubs, and especially from the Jacobin Club, were on principle non-partisan, and that they openly aimed at the establishment of a new federalism. Robespierre and the Jacobin government, because they hated the very notion of a separation and division of powers, had to emasculate the societies as well as the sections of the commune. Under the condition of centralization of power.
Roger, I'm sorry I made a mistake.
Okay.
Yeah, you did.
So what was it, the next paragraph?
It's not that paragraph. It's the paragraph that begins, only a few words need to be said about the sad ending.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you. It's in the middle of this paragraph.
All right, this is a longer paragraph. Since there existed no area of agreement between the parliamentary factions, it became a matter of, oh, I see, it's above that.
Yes,
the parties, or rather the factions, which played a disastrous role in the French Revolution, and then became the roots of the whole continental party system, had their origin in the assembly and the ambitions and fanaticism that developed between them, even more than the pre-revolutionary motives of the men of the revolution, were things the people at large neither understood nor shared. So she's here talking about party politics, right? And what she's saying is that the party politics of the Jacobins against the Girondists and others were driven by the ambitions and fanaticism of the people in the parliament, which were separate from the people at large. And so this is a critique of party politics, more so than anything else. And I don't think it has much to do with, to the extent it has to do with the rest, it has to do with the sense that for her, insofar as the representatives in Parliament or in Congress, as you will, see themselves not as sifting the opinions and trying to find a public truth, nor as per se, well, or maybe as representatives of a people, but see themselves as fanatical and ambitious um, uh, leaders of interest groups or factions that they want to have win. Um, uh, they 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 cease to represent in any way a kind of revolutionary tradition or spirit, a public spirit. And so that's what she's talking about in this paragraph.
And what about utopia and the ideals?
Yeah, the question of ideal, I mean, that's a complicated one, Denise. I mean, on the one hand, uh no, right? She clearly thinks this was real. Um on the other hand, it's never 100%, right?
No, a utopia for us.
You know, but she holds this ideal as an ideal, but also as something realizable. I mean, she thinks there are, I mean, maybe never fully realizable, but she does believe that the public spirit is a real thing. Um, Not that you ever will get, there's not like one public spirit, but that the idea of deliberation, sifting through opinions. I mean, we just had 2 nights ago, the RN Center ran a citizen assembly workshop in Brooklyn, and from what I gather, I mean, people were just enamored and amazed by this idea of just by sitting around for a couple hours and talking and thinking and listening to other. It's not that you come to a truth. It's not that you come to like the one true public spirit, but you come to see what it means to develop an idea that is not my idea or your idea or a liberal idea or a conservative idea, but an idea that at least attempts to be a public idea. And that's what Arendt valued in judgment, in the idea of an enlarged mentality that tries to sift through all the different perspectives and come to a public judgment. And it's what she also thought the Senate as an institution was designed to do. Whether it will ever, no, it will never fully get there, but so far as it aims to do that and is committed to that as an idea, that idea lives in the world, and that is essential to public freedom. When the Senate becomes another representative, democratically elected representative body that pursues partisan interests, it loses that deliberative uh, uh, experience, that deliberative institutional capacity. Um, we lose in the United States one of the core institutional um, uh, uh, I, characteristics of a free republic. And, again, Arendt never says the Senate should not be democratically elected. As far as I know, maybe she did in an interview or something. Um, but my guess is she's at least I don't know what she would think, but I think she does think that in the move to the democratic election of the Senate is part of the loss of the Senate's role as a deliberative body. And I don't think you can avoid that. That doesn't mean we should go back to having state representatives pick the senators. I'm not saying that. But it does mean we have to be aware that it becomes much harder for the Senate to play its constitutional role. Glenn.
Roger, I want to keep this baking metaphor going and keep thinking about sifting. There's a lot of sifting going on here. Because I want to get a tighter grip with your help on what she means or understands on page 219. I've got the Penguin. When she talks about the Senate as the medium through which all public views must pass, as by the group they are purified. Why does she use that word, Roger? It struck me as a word she doesn't use a lot. It has, maybe religious connotations, scientific connotations. She says this sifting removes opinions that are merely arbitrary and idiosyncratic. And then back on page 218, she teaches, or she borrows the teaching that the Senate was devoted to representation of opinion on which all governments rest. Can you help make those terms arbitrary, idiosyncratic, purified opinion on which all governments rest a little more concrete for me? What might be an example of polluted opinion to her mind that is in need of filtering and
Okay.
purifying
Yeah. So
to preserve opinions on which all governments rest? Thank you. And
yeah.
happy
No.
early Thanksgiving to you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. By the way, if anyone is around the RN Center, we are going to have a Thanksgiving dinner on Monday night, and you're all cordially invited to it at 6 o'clock on Monday night at the RN Center. Um, so the idea of opinion as uh as as what on what all government rests is her view that again there is no truth in politics, right? All politics is in the end about opinion. Um, the problem with opinion, and again, that's what she's here talking about, is the problem of public opinion, is that public opinion, if it's understood democratically, can lead to tyranny and conformity. Um, and so the challenge for a free government, um, which always is going to be based on opinion, because what else are you going to base it on? There's no truth. Um, is how to uh, allow opinion to govern without it becoming conformist and oppressive and tyrannical. She says on at the from 217 to 218, it is not only and perhaps not even primarily because of the overwhelming power of the many that the voice of the few loses all strength and all plausibility under such circumstances. Public opinion, by virtue of its unanimity, provokes unanimous opposition and thus kills true opinions everywhere. So when you're in a world of public opinion, of Democrat and Republican, of right and the left, one side, right, becomes an overwhelming power. The other side simply tries to um, oppose it, and you don't get to any kind of opinion that tries to find what she here calls uh, um, true opinions, but she doesn't mean true opinions in the sense of true, that it can be discovered. But what she means by true opinions here are, in your baking world, sifted opinions or purified opinions, um, or opinions that are, in the sense, less opinions and more what she calls the public spirit. Um, why does she use the word purified? Well, uh, she takes it from the Federalist Papers. Um,
Okay.
uh, well, I don't know. I'm assuming she does. She's here citing a number of
10.
different
She cites
Federalist
10.
papers. I don't know if any of the actual quotations include
Okay.
purification or not. I'd have to go back and look at that. Um, but what she is taking from the Federalist Papers, right, is this idea uh, that, as she says on at the bottom of 218, top of 219, 229 in my edition, she says both multiplicity of interests and diversity of opinions were accounted among the characteristics of free government, right? If you have a free government, you're going to have many opinions and many interests. Their public representation constituted a republic as distinguished from a democracy, where a small number of citizens assemble and administer the government in person. The point is that what a republic means is that instead of everyone voting and trying to find what the public opinion is, you get a small number of people together, like in a Senate, and you have them debate and deliberate. Um, and she says that this kind of government was more than a mere technical device for government among large populations. It wasn't just that we couldn't fit everyone in the room, and so we put a few in the room, right? She says, on the contrary, limitation to a small and chosen body of citizens was to serve as the great purifier of both interest and opinion, to guard against the confusion of a multitude. Um, why is she using the word purifying? Sifting. Because what she wants to say is, look, there's lots of opinions. There's an infinite number of opinions and plurality of opinions in any politics, right? And the point is, how do you take all those opinions? Well, one answer is you go back to what Denise was talking about, and you use party politics, and you use ambition and fanaticism, and you try and win. And we're all so familiar with that, right? Um, and the other answer is you try and get a group of people in the room and you talk to each other and you listen and you try and find a common public spirit. It's not the true one, there's no true one, but it's true in the sense that it is less fanatical, it's not seeking to win, it's actually trying to build a common sense or a common world. And that's what she's aiming at with this idea of purification and sifting.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bernie.
Um, I suspect a number of us are watching Ken Burns this week and his latest documentary on the American Revolution. It's an interesting time to be reading Hannah Arendt at the same time. Um, as I hear Arendt discussing um, freedom, I often have echoing in my head Eric Foner and his book, The Story of American Freedom, and their respective thoughts about what freedom is. One of the things that the Burns documentary is highlighting is the degree to which the revolution, was a conservative revolution, and especially the Southern colonies, understood what they were up to was preserving the institution of slavery. And I know that a lot of the scholarship on the degree to which this was the case has been post 1975. So after Hannah Arendt would have even been aware of it. But I'm so as a foremost channeler of Hannah Arendt, Roger, I'm wondering if you have any thoughts, and that the Senate was really, this way of institutionalizing an institution that was likely to help protect slavery from those who would want to interfere with it. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on what Hannah Arendt, how she would have processed the last half century of scholarship on the role preserving slavery played in the American founding.
Um, you know, so on one level, no, I'm not going to I'm not going to take your bait, Bernie. I'm not going to try and say what Hannah Arendt would say about, scholarship that she may not have known about at the time. Um, you know, uh, I think that um, I think there's been some great scholarship about some of this stuff. You know, I don't think that the only role of the Senate was to preserve slavery. And I don't think that's the argument anyone makes, but maybe it is. I don't know. Um, I'm sure it had some role in it. You know, I don't agree with the scholarship that says that the Constitution was, designed to preserve slavery. I think that that's a mistake, but that's me. And we could have that larger conversation at another time, but I don't think it's worth doing now. I mean, I think it was a compromise. There's no doubt about it. It did preserve slavery, but I think it was written very much intentionally with the idea of many of the people involved and hope that it would see the end of slavery, which it did. Um, but we can have that. That's I don't know what Arendt would say about that. I mean, and I don't want to speculate. Um, what there's no reason for me to speculate on what she would say. I think Arendt saw the Senate as a conservative institution, which no doubt it was, and she supported that. Arendt was neither a conservative nor a liberal, but she certainly thought that conservatives and liberals and progressives uh, were all part of the country, and the country needed to be able to speak to all of them, and that any meaningful free republic needs both conservative and liberal elements to it. And the very idea of setting them in opposition to each other, that these are conservatives and these are progressives and they're opposed, she would, that I can say, she would think that's bad history and bad politics. In fact, that the point of the Constitution for her was finding a way to trying to find a way, and I think largely brilliantly successfully, at least for a moment, to overcome those divisions and articulate an idea of human dignity and solidarity that could be that could somehow encapsulate them all, despite the imperfections and despite the sin, as she calls it, and rightly so, of slavery, and of course other things as well, including genocide. Um, so you know, that's how I imagine she would approach it. Robert, Robert, you there?
Um, yes, yeah. Roger, I want to ask a question about the explanatory force of this rather baggy and fluctuating concept that I was worried about at the very beginning of the book, the modern age. And let me make a point of going to page 226. I think I have the same edition you do. In the paragraph that begins, terminologically speaking, the effort to recapture the lost spirit of revolution, etc. And in that paragraph, she mentions Harrington and Montesquieu. Now, I read your article about the modern age, and I went back and looked at some of the passages in The Human Condition. She says the modern age started with three things: Galileo's telescope, the explorations of Columbus and da Gama. She and you also use the phrase, which I think is meant to stand for the spirit of the modern age, both world alienation and earth alienation. I'm not clear how Galileo's telescope or the Protestant Reformation or Vasco da Gama or world alienation has anything at all to do with Harrington or Montesquieu. I just don't understand. Is there anything you can say to help?
Um, First of all, thank you for you brought a lot to bear on the question, and I appreciate the seriousness of it. Uh, so one thing to say is you have to look at what she means by the modern age in each book or essay somewhat on its own. One of the truths about Hannah Arendt is that she's not a systematic thinker, and she writes, somewhat um, journalistically, and she writes her opinion. She likes to give her opinion, and she doesn't always do work to make sure that in 1963 she's using modern age the same way she was using it in 1958. So let's just take a look in this book on revolution. She's using modern age in a particular way, right? What she's saying is that the modern age here uh, is the concern with and the spirit of the modern age was preoccupied from the beginning. It's in the same paragraph. It's on 226, but 216 if you have the Penguin book. The spirit of the modern age, interestingly and significantly enough, was preoccupied from the beginning with the stability and durability of a purely secular, worldly realm, which means, among other things, that its political expression stood in flagrant contradiction to the scientific, philosophic, and even artistic utterances of the age, all of which were much more concerned as such with novelty as such than anything else. In other words, the political spirit of modernity was born when men were no longer satisfied that empires would rise and fall in sempiternal change. It is as though men wished to establish a world which could be trusted to last forever, precisely because they knew how novel everything was that their age attempted to do. So, um, I don't want to say that it's not the same completely, but I want to at least start from um, this idea that for her, in this book, where modern age is not thematized in any way like it is in the human condition, right? Um, the modern age simply stands, or at least I shouldn't say that. At least at the beginning, it stands for in art and science. It stands for the idea of um, novelty and progress. But in politics, almost in a counter reaction to that, what the modern age seeks is stability. And um, Harrington and Montesquieu are two representatives of political modernity insofar as what they seek in their political sociological thinking is that kind of stability. And that's what she's referring to here. Could we tie it to her idea of the modern age in the human condition and world alienation? Certainly. At a time of world alienation, and thus a sense of real loss and abandonment, political stability may be more necessary than ever. And so we could try and tie them together. But I just want to say that, and this is a general rule of reading Arendt, and some people love this about her, and some people find it frustrating. You can't just go and take words and concepts she uses in one place and assume that she's using them in the same way. She just doesn't do that. She's not a systematic thinker like that. And so here she's pulling up something about the modern spirit, which of course has relations to what she said in the human condition, but I think is different. Is that so?
Okay.
And by the way, it's not so thematized in this book. Now, it's not unimportant, right? Because a big part of this argument, right, is that revolutions, both revolutions were modern in both the scientific artistic sense, in that they were obsessed with novelty and the new, but they were also modern in the sense of Harrington and Montesquieu, in that they were obsessed with stability and permanence. And so revolutions are fundamentally modern in that sense of being both obsessed with newness and of stability. And that's the explanatory force of the modern age comments in this chapter. Okay.
Okay. Thanks.
Thank you. But I think it's great that you're trying to bring these different books and her ideas together. I think it'd be an interesting article or discussion, but I don't think it's obvious that they You know, that I don't think she's thinking about what she wrote in the Human Condition here. Okay. Thank you. Lee, you're up.
Yeah, thank you, Roger. I'll be quick. There are a couple of people waiting with questions. On page 221 of the 1963 Viking edition, Arendt says the consequences of ignorance, oblivion, and failure to remember are conspicuous. And she's talking about the revolutionary spirit. Well, one major figure, American figure of the 19th century, probably the most important American figure of the 19th century, Abraham Lincoln, did not forget. And of course, in his Gettysburg Address, he says 7 years ago. And so the revolutionary spirit was not entirely forgotten. Arendt, and I've gone through a number of her books, Arendt never really looked at Lincoln and his speeches and his life. And it would have been interesting if she had and been able to talk about Lincoln and the way in which he tried to revive the American revolutionary spirit. So
It's a great point, Lee. She does, and I mean, not again. I don't know how much she talks about Lincoln, but it's certainly not widely thematized in her work. You're right.
There's no mention of there's one mention of Lincoln in her correspondence with Jaspers, and that's Jaspers' comment on the day that Kennedy was assassinated. Jaspers writes, "Are we witnessing another Abraham Lincoln?"
Yeah.
No mention in Young Brill's biography, so uh, uh, it's unfortunate that Rent didn't have the time uh, to really engage with Lincoln.
Yeah, no, it's a nice point. I mean, I'm not sure if she would have thought Lincoln was doing what she thought necessary, which was a remembrance of these principles. I mean, Lincoln certainly believed in freedom and equality, and he certainly believed in union and stability of sorts. But whether he fundamentally believed in the Federalist principle or um, participation in government and public spirit, I'm not sure.
Yeah.
I'm not an expert. Um, I think Lincoln is a fascinating thinker, and I think it would be a great, essay to write about whether Lincoln is sort of a forgotten, um, uh, you know, person who thematized the American Revolution. He certainly gave it a theme. Whether it's the Arendtian theme or not, I'm not sure. But thank you.
Thank you.
Julie.
Hello. First of all, I'd like to just prelude this by saying I'm a Canadian. I don't feel that I know very much about the American Constitution, and I found this to be a very instructive read. I want to point to on page 230 of the Penguin edition, where she says, and she's quoting Carpenter, she says, if she talks about a feared and elective despotism. And then the Carpenter says, if once our people became inattentive to the public affairs, you and I and Congress and assemblies, judges and governors shall all become wolves. And I wanted to understand better what that means. She goes on further, and when you read the notes at the end, she says that this talks about the fact that there's an apathy that when that apathy happens, that gives an opportunity for government, as I understand it, to take over in a way.
Yeah.
And first of all, is that perhaps what might be happening today in the United States? And then but the second thing is, if she also talks about the fact that the only time when individual people are really able to have any kind of a say in what's going on is on voting day, then where is the channel that the voice of the individual people comes up to prove that they're not apathetic? I guess that's what my question is.
Okay, great. Two questions, both good. So the first one about this quote from Carpenter, it's in the context of Jefferson saying he feared an elective despotism as bad as or as worse than a tyranny they had risen against. I mean, this goes back to the question that Denise had asked earlier about fanaticism and ambition of the party politicians. And what she's saying here, the Carpenter quote is that if our people become inattentive and lethargic and corrupt, um, Congress and assemblies and judges and governors shall all become wolves. They'll basically all pursue their own public opinion, their own interests, um, and and there won't be um, any people. There won't be any popular protest against that, and that raises the second part of your question, which is that again for her, where does the failure of the American Constitution or the weakness of it was that it didn't provide an institutional space for citizens, for people to get together and talk. Now, it could be about it could be about the environment, or it could be about sewers, or it could be about school teachers, or it could be about immigrants. What she thinks is that you need people talking about the public space and the public world, because that's how they learn, that's how they educate themselves, and that's how they acquire opinions that are firm and thoughtful and not just um, you know uh, based on YouTube videos and algorithms, or based on demagogues, or based on whatever newspaper they're reading. And so it's that, just like the Senate in that conversation we were having about sifting and purifying, purifies and sifts. Simply having talking societies, whether they're just talking societies or whether they're wards in the Jeffersonian sense, which we'll get to, or whether they're citizen assemblies, or whether they're, a Hannah Arendt reading group where people get together and talk about ideas and have to sift their opinions against other people's opinions, including against Hannah Arendt's, and maybe at least broaden their perspective and broaden their idea of a public spirit. Um, and and in doing that, in those conversations, in that deliberation, in that active speaking and talking with others, we sift and purify our thinking and our opinions, and that's what she's talking about.
And further on, she brings up the quote about if 10 men were powerful enough, they could overtake the thousands. And I think it was in respect to the French Revolution that quote she was quoting from. Is there a channel within the way that the United States is set up and the governing of the United States for those 10 people to exert an influence?
Well, I mean, I think, the old place was town hall meetings
Yeah, that's what I seem to hear from what you're saying. Yeah.
and we've lost that tradition, and there's no constitutional space for it, right? That's the problem. Um, I've been making an argument for the last 5 or so years, and we've created a democracy innovation hub, which is to say, look, there's not one answer to this, right? But one new institution that could be quite valuable are these citizen assemblies where randomly selected citizens are picked. And again, the advantage of this from my point of view is not that it's representative in the sense of that you have X number of women or white people or men or black people or in rural people or urban people. Yes, you want to get a general representative sample. That's why it's random. But I don't think the power of it comes from that, and that's a difference I have with a lot of the people who are in this world. They think that what's advantageous about citizen assemblies is that they're more representative than our current political leaders, and that they want to use statistical techniques to even make them more representative. I'm less interested in that. To
Roger, is
me,
there someplace we could read about these? I'm sorry, is there someplace we could read on the website about these citizen assemblies?
yeah, I mean, if you go to the website, there's a page on Democracy Innovation Hub. I have a number of essays on it, and there's a bunch of videos on our website about it.
Okay,
But
thanks.
let me just to finish my thought, and then we'll end. The advantage of this process for me is not necessarily the representative aspect so much as the deliberative aspect, which we go back to the sifting and purifying aspect.
Thank you very much.
All right, we're out of time. Thank you all very much. We're taking 2 weeks off. Happy Thanksgiving to everybody. A quick reminder: on December 4th
Yes.
is Hannah Arendt's 50th anniversary of her death. And
Wow.
there will be events all around the world honoring that. If I'll be in Berlin giving a talk on the 6th or 7th, and in Lisbon on the 9th. But at Bard, and there's also an event in New York, in New York City. But at Bard on the 4th, Jana Mater and Steve Maslow, one of our longtime members, will be leading a remembrance and ceremony for Hannah Arendt that will visit her grave and then have a reception at the Arendt Center on December 4th at Bard. And you can find more information on our website or in the Amor Mundi. And I hope you have a chance to join them. Thank you all very much and enjoy reading Hannah Arendt.